Corv Interim here. And in this one, I shall be covering something that Gin wanted me to create an account of. Yes, she was most insistent about it. An account of a familiar class struggle in an unfamiliar environment. They were condemned to die with the rest of the common folk when London was destroyed. But they rose up. They commandeered the ships that were meant to carry the wealthy to safety and sailed north. There they found a generator and claimed it for themselves. They had to gather all the people in that new city before the lords arrived and robbed them of their freedom again. They would never submit. They had barely started, and the one that was appointed as leader of this city decided to sign a law involving the children. Specifically one where they could work in safe jobs. Disgusting, I know. But I suspect that this was mostly due to necessity rather than choice, as far as he was concerned. At least I assume that their leader was a he. And apparently the people that was heading towards that generator, they were in groups of 11. Well, 11 groups, to be more accurate. The first had arrived by this point. As for the other 10, well, I will get to that. Although the first priority for the leader of the city of the refugees was to provide the basics. And one of the basics, well, it involved a cookhouse. Because the people needed to eat at some point. Most of the people were gathering wood, largely because wood was needed for, well, pretty much everything. Although a better means of gathering it would be needed later, because it would not last forever. It rarely does. Speaking of which, a workshop was also built, so that research could be conducted. research vital for making that city sustainable. Especially when it'd be unknown when the other groups would arrive. As for the generator being on, that would only be needed during the nights, at least until the temperature would decrease. There was plenty of time to make preparations before then, including an increase in the amount of food. Well, there was only enough food for 2 days with the current population, and so hunters' huts would be needed. Yes, oh no. This situation seems relatively mundane at the start, but I suspect that it will not remain so. With the workshop complete, it was time to start some research, even though it would need to be completed the next day. A steam hub was considered a priority, largely to expand the amount of areas that could be worked and buildings that could be heated. Well, the resources needed. A relative level of confidence to gather. Well, wouldn't want the workers to get frostbites. This leader certainly wasn't. Oh yes, and as for the gender of this leader, well, I haven't gone through all the documents covering this yet. So, please be patient, I will clarify this eventually. Oh, and as for shelter, most of it was provided, although the rest would need to be built the next day because, well, resources would not allow for it. But at least the people would not go hungry. I think I remember... sorry. I remember the song Rule Britannia. That sounds hollow now. And to think it was originally... a song that showed how divided the Hanoverians were. Quite possibly the most dysfunctional family. Royal family, to be more precise, since the Tudors. Oh yes, and this leader identified coal and also sources of iron. Both would be needed once a means of safely gathering it are opened up. And by safely gathering it, that would mean increasing the coal supply along with being able to construct steam hubs. Oh yes, and by this point, at least one had gotten sick, which meant a medical post would be needed. Well, considering the groups of refugees, the lack of a workforce would eventually be no longer a problem. As for the next law to sign, he decided that sustaining life was better than radical treatments. Well, it was something to consider. Especially considering that a lack of a means of making them able to work was not available at this point. As these people were starting from, well, practically nothing. For them, this was a fresh start, where there was a possibility that they could make something better. The child labour, they would need to change that eventually, if they were to practice what they preached. So far, this sounded like this was somewhere in between our city and Winterhome before that happened. The priorities of the people of that city were simple. Have a medical post built, complete the accommodation for those already living there, and have the steam hub researched before the temperature dropped, so that resources could be gathered. The people were puzzled by their leader's decision to shut down the generator. But this was to save coal, because the temperature would drop the next day rather than that day. This was understandable, as there was a steam hub needed to increase the amount of coal gathered. Both a source of wood and coal would need to be within a heat zone. With the accommodation nearing completion, there was just a wait for a medical post to be constructed, so that those that were sick or injured could be treated. Which could be done by this point. And research was coming along nicely. By this point, more refugees arrived. The second group of the 11. This gave the people of that city much needed hope. Although another tent was needed. Thankfully, there was still space within the heat zone. Immediately around the generator. A child was injured at work. They were given a day off to recover. It was a risk, but he obviously considered the risk worth taking. More so for survival than any other reason. And by this point, a steam hub could be constructed. And nearby was a source of coal. There was enough steel for at least 2 steam hubs to be constructed. One would definitely be needed for on the way to that seam of coal. As for what to research next, a beacon. Yes, a beacon to give the remaining groups a navigation aid. A much-needed navigation aid, I might add. Although the steam hub was moved to another source of steel, and also a more long-term source of wood. And then a gathering post was constructed near one group of resources. A gathering post that could gather from multiple sources at once, which could also be useful for other things long term. Although one thing that was most useful at this point was a source of food, which meant that the hunter's hut was something that was needed.
Finish your labors, people. The work day is up.
Although it would not be enough to sustain the population, not with just one anyway. It would at least give some time to build up the amount of food available. Sorry about that. I really need to get someone to perform some routine maintenance on this. Anyway. Yes, and at this point, the people wanted a beacon constructed, and that would be worked on. Well, it was being researched. The beacon to the north was shut down. And then a new law was written. Well, new for that city anyway. It would appear that the leader of that city was undecided of what to write into law next. Ultimately, it was extra rations for the ill.
New law in the city.
Well, that would be useful when there'd be a surplus. The first hunter's hut had certainly enough to start gathering food. With the current population, one would not be enough. In fact, it would be recommended to, well, have more than one. Or at least, yes. It was recognized that more efficient means of gathering food would be needed. And as for coal, even with the gathering post, that would not be enough. At least at this point, there was many challenges for this leader to deal with. A shortage of food supplies, a lack of means of efficiently gathering resources, and the uncertainty of when more would be arriving. The only thing that was certain was that the temperature would decrease. First on the third day, and then a few days after it would decrease more. Which meant much preparations would need to be made, including a reliable coal supply. One such supply would need a means of utilizing that coal seam to the southeast. There would also need to be an alternative way of gathering food to sustain so many people. Time will tell how this leader deals with this situation. Well, I will cover it eventually. Although, just before the shift started... Oh, yes, a protective mother was concerned for her child. Although this leader refused to make exceptions, because it would imply favoritism. With the decrease in temperature, a larger coal supply was a necessity. Although with so few in that city, how would a reliable coal supply be established? Well, keep listening and you will find out.